I almost forgot the red button. That would have been terrible. So this keynote, I'm calling it Real World DevOps. I'll get into why I want to call it Real World DevOps in a bit. And this is what we're going to go through. What is DevOps, some prerequisites, some tools, things like that. But before all that, I want to talk a little bit about me. So Stephen mentioned some of the things about me. You probably know who I am because my name was on the schedule and all that stuff. I work at Acquia, not Nullabot. I'm not saying that never will happen. I'm just saying right now I work at Acquia. And I'm a senior technical architect. I build hosting infrastructure. I get to use lots of buzzword tech like Kubernetes and AWS and cloud and things like that. I also maintain Drupal VM, which as of last year, it was the most popular local development environment for Drupal. This year, we'll see if that changes. There's going to be a session at DrupalCon about that. I also run a couple software as a service products, one of them called Hosted Apache Solr, one of them Server Check-in. These services have been up for a combined 15 years with 99.99% uptime. So that's pretty cool. I also write and continuously update. I self-publish these books so I can write an edition and then I can give hundreds more editions in a timely fashion. Ansible for DevOps, and because I love buzzwords and they make lots of sales, I'm writing another one called Ansible for Kubernetes. So I'm writing a couple books. And finally, I maintain a large ecosystem of Ansible roles for automation, as well as lots of automation projects and Drupal projects that have almost 20,000 stars on GitHub, almost 10,000 forks. So it's a lot of open source work. Also I have 3 children under the age of 6. They're a handful. I have a strong passion for photography. I spend a lot of time practicing, doing fun things. I help with some events in St. Louis, doing the photography forum. I maintain 4 Drupal sites for local nonprofits. And I love spending time with my wife and my family. And you might be thinking, this guy probably doesn't spend any time with his wife and his family. How could he? And if you're speaking of this weekend, sadly, you're correct because I'm here with you. But that's a good thing for you guys, hopefully. We'll see at the end of the presentation if it was worth it or not. But I'm happy to be here in Rhode Island with all of you. And events like this encourage me to continue giving back as much as I can. On a typical weeknight, though, I'm headed upstairs around 5 or 6 p.m. after I finish my work for the day. And I spend some time with my family for dinner. We have some after meal activities. We say our prayers, we put the kids to bed, all these different things. And on weekends, it's pretty rare that I have any extra work to do. So we do things like go to the zoo, have fun, and we spend a lot of time growing together as a family. And some nights, probably every other night-ish, I'll spend a couple hours after the kids are in bed doing some open source development work or updating my book, or in the past couple weeks working on this presentation. And so, again, you might say, how is it possible that he could actually do all these different things and have time with his family and not go completely insane? If you want the answer to that, I apply complex, self-healing, highly scalable DevOps architectures to all my projects using most of the tools shown in this diagram. I'm actually kidding. That's not true. That would be insane. But who here has seen this graphic before? Anybody? So not too many people. A few people have. This is called the cloud native landscape, and it's a very popular graphic in the ops and sysadmin world of all these tools that are awesome and amazing and DevOpsy. And the reason I'm showing you this picture is because by the end of this weekend, you should know all the tools on this diagram and how to use them. I'm kidding again. So to be honest, though, these are very buzzword worthy, and they earn lots of money for a lot of companies. But you might actually be doing DevOps, or you could do DevOps better using just Apache and Drupal. And notice that neither of those 2 tools actually appear on this thing at all. So, what is DevOps? And the framework that I use is real-world DevOps. But before I talk about what I think DevOps is and what I think is more of a useful definition, I want to talk a little bit about what the industry thinks DevOps is. Microsoft says you can buy DevOps. You can get a purchase order and just get this product from them, Azure DevOps, and boom, you have DevOps, right? Is that, that sounds pretty reasonable and pretty cool. You just give some money to somebody and you all of a sudden have DevOps because you have these tools. I also see a lot of teams talk about how Docker transformed their development process and made everything faster and better and more awesomer and things like that. And these tools that are Docker-based are so amazing. And so those teams are doing DevOps, right? Maybe, maybe not. And to do DevOps, you have to have cloud computing. Like, you have to be all in the cloud. All your stuff happens in the cloud, and you're very cloudy in AWS or Google Cloudy, because that's where DevOps is, right? Also, you have to be super agile. You have to do all these awesome agile things. You have to have sprints and Kanban, scrums, pair programming, pointing poker, and et cetera, right? Yeah? No? Hopefully not, because that would be impossible to do all of that for every project that you work on. Let's talk about a few different definitions that we get from companies that have DevOps tools. So the first one is people working together to build, deliver, and run resilient software at the speed of their particular business. This is from GitLab. GitLab is a pretty awesome tool for hosting Git repositories and doing CI and CD, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And that's a pretty neat company, too. They have a lot of remote workers, so they have to do things. They have to have good processes and communication. And it sounds like they think there's a people component. So there's, it's something about people, and also a correlation between speed, like doing things quickly, or at least as quickly as the rest of your industry. So those are some good things. How about Atlassian? They make things like Jira, Bitbucket, Confluence, some other tools, HipChat. And they say that DevOps helps development and operations teams be more efficient, innovate faster, and deliver higher value. So it sounds like it's, again, about teams, about people, making things better. So that's good. And then this definition, which is interesting because I found it from Gartner first, but then I started noticing it's also all over the web everywhere else. I think it's because it's stuffed full of buzzwords that can sell software. So that rapid IT service delivery through the adoption of agile, lean practices in the context of a system-oriented approach. I have no idea what that means whatsoever. But this one is the one that I've seen more often. So a lot of times people are confused about DevOps because they see these weird things and they see a lot of methodologies and products for sale. And it's funny, Gartner is a company that they profit off selling solutions, reviews, and things like that. So they're going to focus on the solution and the tool. They're not going to focus on the people and the process that makes your workplace better. So what do I say about DevOps? That's kind of what the industry says. After all, one of my books has the word DevOps in the title. So surely I can't just be selling out like Microsoft and using that buzzword to increase sales. To be honest, I did use the word to increase visibility a bit. And that's why my second book has the word Kubernetes in it. So my third book, I'm not sure what's going to be the next hot buzzword, but it will definitely be on that. But my definition of DevOps is a little bit simpler. I say that DevOps is making people happier while making apps better. And I want to focus on those two aspects because I think that gets to kind of the core of DevOps. And if you don't keep that focus, then you start diving deeper into tools and you kind of derail the whole reason for doing DevOps in the first place. And I call this the non-cargo cult definition of DevOps. And cargo cult is the idea in software development of you see some practice some company is doing, like let's say GitHub or Microsoft, Apple, Google, something like that. They're doing this awesome thing, and it is awesome the way that they're doing it, but you do it because they do it. It's not because it's the best thing for you to do. It's just because they do it. So my definition has two components. The first one is making people happier. So it's primarily about people. The first thing that we have to think about with DevOps is our team of developers, our team of engineers and QA and business people, even our end users. It's all about people. Even if it's a team with just one person, it's still you and whoever's using the software that you're building. So you have to figure out, no matter what your team size is, ways to work together and make users happy. And another thing that's kind of important is not burning out, because burnout causes a lot of problems, not the least of which your product can't exist if everybody burns out on it. And some of the things that I see in a team that's implementing DevOps successfully First is reduced friction between all the different people in the teams. So you're talking about security people, you're talking about QA for testing and review, you're talking about the end user, or if you're in an agency, the client who's doing acceptance testing, even sometimes the site users who might be in the loop if you're doing support, things like that. There's less friction. Instead of being us against them, or something like we'll do our part and then loop somebody else and then they'll do their part, and you have this cycle where there's not a lot of intercommunication. People talk to each other. There's open communication. There's Slack channels. There's chat, whatever kind that is. There's email. If you have a shared workspace, there's communication. People are talking. And instead of requirements being added whenever that group gets their batch, like after you finish a project, security takes it and they start reviewing like, oh, this security problem exists, and then you send it back to development. It's something that's in the life cycle. Security helps your team, your developers, to know here's the things we expect while you're developing this application. And testing happens during your development process as well. Something that happens partly alongside this is reduced burnout. So instead of people getting frustrated because they have communications barriers and soul-sucking issues with talking to people, there's a lot less burnout. Friction creates heat, and heat creates burnout in developers' lives. There's also a lot more frequent code deploys, and usually it's in the middle of the workday. This also feeds back into the reduced burnout because I don't know if anybody here has been on a team like this, but I was on a project where we were not allowed to do releases until after 10 p.m. on weeknights, and it created a lot of burnout because we were up late. Usually the deployment would have issues, and then we'd have to call developers who are sleeping, who are barely able to communicate, get them to do a hotfix. The hotfix wouldn't work, and it would just be a terrible night. We'd all come in the office the next day trying to continue fixing it. That's not a good way to live. It's not a good way to deploy. Also, another thing that I see a lot is stable teams. And this can be kind of hard in some models, but when you have a team, not just a project team, but a team of people that stay together for a longer period of time, they can sometimes they can start to improve their processes. They can get to know each other better. And they can start to kind of have relationships and kind of be able to work together a lot better. And the last thing that I see a lot of is there's no heroes. There's no developer who saves the day, no operations person who finds a way to get that thing done. Nobody has to work through weekends getting releases ready when there's some new requirement that pops in. Because the process of DevOps emphasizes stability and work-life balance. How many people here have ever seen an email praising the heroic efforts of some developer or somebody who did something miraculous to save the day with a project? I know I've seen it. A lot of people have. So I don't think that should be seen as a heroic deed. It's good that person did that. It's great for them. But it should be seen as a tragic failure, not of that person, but of the system that led to that happening. If you have that happening, if it happens once a year, that's one thing, but a lot of teams I see, it seems to happen weekly or monthly. That's not a good sign. So DevOps is about making people happier. That's the first part. But you can have the happiest team in the world and have a terrible app, have a terrible Drupal site, whatever you're going to be building. So it's also important to keep it centered on apps and on sites that you build with Drupal. You can't afford anymore nowadays to develop at a really glacial pace. You can't say, we're going to have 3 quarters before this next feature comes out. You have to be able to deliver new features and make things better and faster and more interesting and more scalable. These things have to happen nowadays with any modern software. And so some of the things that I see in teams with that are practicing DevOps to make their apps better. One thing is continuous delivery. So the idea that your code, the code for your project, is always deployable. So whatever's in your master branch, or you could have a production branch or something, it's always going to be able to go to your production environment. And it passes all the automated tests you have. And you have automated tests. Even if it's one test, it's infinitely better than 0 tests. Stephen actually had a good presentation a little bit ago in this room And if you didn't get to see it and you're interested, he goes through kind of the process of how you start to figure out how to do testing. First it's manual, then you figure out a way to get it automated, and then as time goes on, you start getting more automation to the point where you start getting confidence in your ability to continuously deliver your application. So another thing that I see a lot is thorough monitoring. Being able to know if you deploy something and performance gets better or worse. Also, if your users are having a really slow experience on your site, do you know that right now? Do you have some way of knowing that? And also, the team gets an alert when their system is impaired but not offline. So there's kind of two levels there. One is my site down? You can use Pingdom, you can use Uptime Monitor, something like that, or Uptime Robot, or Server Check-in, a product that I have. I'm terrible about selling my own stuff. Anyways, that's one layer. You definitely need that. You need to know, is my site down? Because you'd be surprised if you never have monitored before. A lot of environments just go down randomly, and you figure out sometimes reasons for it. Sometimes you don't. But another layer to that, which is a lot deeper and can help your whole site experience be better, is if you can see what people are experiencing. So there's application performance monitoring tools, and there's Pingdom has a real user monitoring, that kind of thing. So those teams have good monitoring. Also, those teams fix problems when they happen. And they also have a policy of bug fixes and maintenance things like updates and patches and instead of putting off something for 6 months, that's part of their regular process. They dedicate time in their project to making things better and making things up to date. And project planning, even for quick sites that an agency might be building, project planning still gives equal importance to things like keeping up to date and making sure that we're not doing kind of things that are not the best practice. If we need to do something like that to get something shipped, there's always, the next step is immediately do it the right way. And finally, there's also a lot quicker delivery of features. Usually the features are broken up into smaller pieces, and branches and pull requests and merge requests that are created on a code base, they rarely last more than a couple days. Very rare. Because the teams realize that anything that lasts more than 3 or 4 days, sometimes maybe a week or two, it becomes infinitely harder for that branch to remain in sync with the production code. You start realizing that small but frequent deployments are much better. And it's one of the most important ways you can make your apps better, because it also makes it easier to fix things when they happen, because of the fact that there's only a small set of changes for each deployment you make, instead of having a bunch of things that you have to wade through. So DevOps is about making apps better. People happier, apps better. And so when you want to start doing DevOps, what are some things that you need to start doing? Again, I looked around the industry for what are some of the common things that I see, and these 4 things popped up. They're good. They're very good. They're important to have for DevOps. Automation, so taking processes that require manual steps. If you do a code deployment and it takes half an hour, just automating that to make it take a minute or 2 is a huge step. But also other things too, like testing and code review. You can automate a lot of that process. So automation is huge. CI/CD is where anytime that you change code, there are things like PHP's CS for linting, and there's Behat for testing. Stephen's presentation talked a little bit about that too. And it makes sure that anytime that you change your code, the code always passes all of those tests and still builds, and you have a home page still existing. CD is along those same lines. You can also continuously deploy it. That means after your code passes and you know that it works, you can also put it into production. So monitoring, we already talked a little bit about that. It's very important for DevOps to know what's actually going on your site. If you're blind, then you can't make improvements. You have to have some visibility. And collaboration. And the reason I put collaboration last, some people put it up a little higher, is because my model for DevOps applies to my projects where I'm the only developer. I don't have to collaborate, so I get to kind of just wedge that right out of there. It's actually the hardest part usually. So, not every project that does what I call DevOps correctly needs to have all 4 of these in the same strength as other projects. But I think we can make this list a little simpler. the prerequisites for doing DevOps right. And I think to do it right, it should be easy to make changes, and it should be easy to fix and prevent problems. And also to prevent any problems that happen from happening twice. So along the first line, easy to make changes, I'm wondering, you don't have to show hands for this, but have you ever timed how long it takes somebody new to your project to get up and running? It doesn't just have to be developers with code. It could also be a new, if you use Jira, a new project manager getting into Jira, knowing the flow, knowing where to go, how to manage tickets. For a developer, getting the code base, installing a local environment, having the data that they need to be able to start pulling up work and doing things and committing code back. Have you ever actually sat down and timed that process? Most people don't do that ever. And sometimes it's pretty excruciating sitting there trying to time it, and you realize you're an hour and a half into this and we still don't have any success. Even if you have a really good process and you use some great tools, it can take a long time for things that you don't even think about if you have had this environment or have had this process working for a long time. And it doesn't just help a new developer. A lot of times you'll get a new computer. Let's say you lost yours or it broke. When you get a new computer, how long does it take you to be productive again? So it needs to be easy to make changes. If it's not easy to do that, if it's not easy and fast to start working on your project locally and to have that process ingrained, it's hard to make changes. And if it's hard to make changes, you're going to be more scared to make changes, and that's not a good thing. That's not DevOps. Once you've made some changes, how do you know that you're not going to break anything that is already existing? Do you have behavioral tests that you can run that verify things like your home page is loading and people can log into your site? And do those tests run really quickly, or does it take a really long time to run? Do those tests run automatically, or do you have to involve some QA team to go in and manually run a bunch of tests? Do you have visual regression tests that verify that when you deploy new code, it's not going to make everything look wrong, like colors are changing here and there, fonts get broken, things like that? Again, with testing, there's layers. There's very basic tests like, does my home page load? Again, that's infinitely better than no tests at all. But you can go on top of that and test all of the most important parts of your website. If there's a form that is not, if it's not working, you're going to lose money, you should probably have an automated test that makes sure that that form is actually working. So, if you can't be sure that your changes won't break things, it's scary and hard to make changes. So you need to be confident that you're not going to break things. And once you deploy your changes to production, how hard is it to go back? How hard is it to revert your process by rolling back? Do you even have a process for rolling back? Have you ever tested that? Do you have backups? Some people don't. A lot of people don't. Have you ever tested the backups that you do have? Do you have any confidence that you can restore your production environment to a state that it was in before a deployment? If you don't, if you can't back out of the broken state, it's going to be scary and hard to make changes. It has to be easy. And the easier and less stressful it is to make the changes, the more willing that your team will be able to make them. And you'll have a lot more confidence, you'll have a lot less stress, you'll have reduced burnout, and it goes back feeding into the making people happier part of things. And there's a quote that I have from the Devops handbook. I have a few resources I'll mention at the end that I think are good for different kinds of people. I'm not saying everybody in here should read it, but some people would be interested. And the quote is that high performers deployed code 30 times more frequently, and the time required to go from committed code to successfully running in production was 200 times faster. I'm not saying that you're going to be deploying code 300 times a day like Netflix or Etsy or something like that. But if you can be confident that your changes are going to work, or that if they don't work, you can easily go back to a working state, you will be making changes more frequently because you'll feel more safe to do that. So the second part of my DevOps prerequisites is making it easy to fix and prevent problems. And making changes has to be easy first, because if you can't make changes easily, you're not going to be able to fix problems easily either. So, are developers able to deploy their own changes to production? A lot of times this isn't the case, but it should be. if you want to make sure that things can be easily fixed and problems can be prevented in the future. Is there a really long, drawn-out process to get change deployed? If you have that confidence that your tests are passing, then you'll probably start making smaller but more frequent changes and letting developers have more control, because you know that they're not going to break everything else. They might have broken functionality going out that they didn't test properly, but at least they won't break the whole site. So developers should be able to deploy to production if their code passes all of the tests in your continuous integration. Once you deploy code, do you know if it's helping your site get better, or if it's breaking your site or making the performance worse? Do you have metrics for things like page load times for end users over time? Do you have any application performance monitoring tools like New Relic or Blackfire, things like that? Do you know your servers, the CPU usage or memory usage, is that going up or down? Do you have access to logs so that you can verify that you aren't all of a sudden spewing out thousands of 500 errors and your end users are not getting a good experience? Without those metrics, you can't make informed decisions about what's broken or whether you've fixed a problem. You can deploy the fix and you're like, well, seems like it might have worked. But if you don't have the detailed logging and metrics for it, you'll never actually know. And when something goes wrong, does everybody go into duck and cover mode and try to find ways to avoid blame for the incident? Or does the whole team come together and try to figure out what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how to make it not go wrong in the future? It's important that people realize that when something goes wrong, it's rarely the fault of that person. If you look at it from a 5,000-foot level, it's rarely that person's fault. It's usually the fault of the system, whether it's requirements that we're missing, whether it's tests that we're missing, whether it's something in your process that just let something slip. So, adding better tests, making better requirements, doing more thorough code review, these kind of things will prevent those issues from ever happening in the first place. And so the idea that a lot of us have in the DevOps world is the idea of a blameless postmortem. And who was it that just talked about this a few minutes ago in the second DevOps presentation this morning? Yeah, Matt? Yeah, Matt from Lullabot had a presentation. If you would like, go back. It will be, I'm sure that Kevin already has it up. If he doesn't, it'll be up in a few minutes. But he talked a lot about the people side of things and how the psychology of the team can affect the way that you approach fixing these kinds of problems. So, what about tools, though? Because most of the time when you talk to people who are in the DevOps realm, they get right into the tool discussion. They start talking about how, just sign up for Microsoft Azure DevOps and boom, you have DevOps. Get an Amazon Cloud account and boom, you have all the tools you need for DevOps. So tools are important, but I always point back to this saying. This is a very old saying. This isn't for software. This dates back, I think, to the 15th or 16th century. It's a poor craftsman that blames his tools. And the idea being that if you're a very good software engineer or if you're a very good carpenter, you can make good products even if your tools aren't the best of the breed, the most expensive and fancy and nice. Earlier I mentioned that you could still be doing DevOps even if you didn't use any of the tools in the cloud-native landscape. Those are very fancy tools, the shiniest and most chrome-plated tools you can get. But you could be using a much older tool that's not even in that list and still be doing DevOps correctly. But you should also fall into the trap of having one of these tools, the golden hammer. And if you can't quite make it out on the screen here, the hammer is hitting a screw. I don't know, I actually did this for this presentation. Have you ever tried nailing a screw in with a hammer? You make pretty much zero progress. You can hit it as hard as you want. Eventually the wood splits. This wood did not split, but a very thin piece of wood did split eventually. So you want to avoid having what's called a golden hammer. And a golden hammer is a tool that somebody loves so much that they use it for purposes that it's not intended for. Sometimes it can work. So if your goal was to get that screw through the piece of wood, eventually the wood will split and the nail will go or the screw will go through the wood, but you might not have the right outcome. The wood is now broken and it's not going to hold anything. So there's a quote that I found a few years ago on Hacker News that I like to go back to whenever I'm thinking about this problem of tools. And it's, and it's the idea that being an expert craftsman, you also have to have the understanding of and the skills to be able to pick the right tools and also know how to use good tools and not quite as good tools to still produce the right results. So a good DevOps practitioner, somebody who's really good at this, knows when it's worth taking the time to learn a new tool, to integrate a new tool, versus when you might want to stick with a tool you know. So I used an example a little bit earlier about a Drupal site. Like, Drupal is great at content modeling and nowadays headless Drupal and all these amazing things. It's not the best thing in the world for building a simple blog static site type thing. But if you already know and use it for everything else, and you're only doing one site that's not like those other ones, you might want to use your golden hammer of Drupal to do that one site. But if you're building a lot of them, you might want to start looking into using a different tool besides Drupal for it. So now that we know a lot about DevOps, here's a project, a little project for you to think about. I want you to build some infrastructure for a low-profile Drupal blog site with a very budget-conscious client with about 10,000 visitors a day. Almost all the traffic is anonymous users, and there's maybe a couple logged-in users who come in every few days and post new posts. What kind of infrastructure do you think would be good for this kind of a Drupal site? Some people answer this. And this looks pretty cool. I mean, you have there's a VPC in Amazon so that everything's isolated, and it has multi-region failover for MySQL. It's using Kubernetes, so it's infinitely scalable until you get to 5,000 servers. And then there's EFS, and that's pretty cool because it's like a file system in the cloud. There's Redis, there's Prometheus and Elasticsearch. I mean, there's a lot of cool things here. And this is awesome. And this thing could scale infinitely. But this is a terrible execution if you're actually trying to do DevOps well. This is not going to be maintainable. It's not going to be that great. Instead, a much better solution would be to have a server that's probably a managed server somewhere, because this client is low budget and they don't have a team of people that can manage all their infrastructure. And maybe if you're worried about a lot of traffic sometimes and being scalable, just throw Cloudflare in front of it. It's all anonymous traffic anyways. So, just because you know how to produce excellent results with excellent tools, like Kubernetes and all these cloudy things and amazing stuff, it doesn't mean you always have to use them. You should know when to use a hammer when you have some nails. If there's just a nail on a board, do use the hammer. So the second architecture is going to cost less, it's going to be easier to maintain, everything about it is better. And the general principle is you need to know yourself, you need to know your tools, you need to don't become what I call an architecture nut, somebody who always tries to do it in the purest, most awesome way possible, because that might not be the best way, and it might not be maintainable. So that being said, earlier I mentioned all the different tools in the cloud-native landscape, but there's a lot of tools that are a little bit more philosophical or a little bit more process-oriented that are actually extremely helpful if you're trying to implement DevOps well. And the first one of these is Yagni. Who here knows what Yagni means? A couple people. All right, you will be enlightened today. So Yagni, whoops, I just went to the wrong page here. Yagni is, it stands for you ain't gonna need it. And the reason I invoke this a lot of times is a lot of people have very aspirational ideas. Their big Drupal app is going to be the next Facebook, or their Drupal app is going to need to do all these amazing things. It seems like in marketing, a lot of times, that's where a lot of these amazing ideas come from. But when you're starting to think about how we're actually going to build these things, you have to say, Yagni, you're not going to need this thing. Someday, yeah, you could become the next Facebook, but chances are you won't, and even if you do, it's going to be a radically different thing by the time you get there. So don't build things that you don't absolutely need. Start with the basics. Having a website running is better than having a scalable website running. So even if it's slower, if you can get it out the door and then improve on it, that's better than trying to architect something amazing and huge and that whole Kubernetes cluster in the cloud. And doing this saves you money, it saves you time, and I've seen this before. Sometimes it even saves a project. A lot of times a project will be building the wrong things for months at a time, and they'll deliver it all, and then it falls flat on its face because nobody actually cared about those things. But if they would have started with the simple parts, people could have slowly course-corrected them to do the right thing. And it's kind of like the gold plating on that hammer. It's spray paint. It's not actual gold. I didn't have that kind of budget. But you start using the hammer. When I started hitting the screw, I keep saying nail. When I hit the screw, it started flaking off. So it's totally worthless to add that gold plating, except for the fact that it made a shiny gold hammer in the picture. But it's worthless. It's useless. You're not going to need it. There you go. So the next tool I'm going to talk about, and I went back and forth in my head so much about some of these terms. The idea of using Japanese terminology for these kind of DevOps practices. Earlier I mentioned cargo culting, and so many people pick up on these words and they think, we're going to do that, we're going to do this Kanban, we're going to have Andon, and we're going to do all these different kinds of things because they sound really cool. But I do like this idea that the Andon board. I was researching some of the motivations behind some of these agile practices because I'm the kind of person that sees something that sounds cool, and some cool companies are doing it, but I want to understand where it comes from and if it actually is cool or not. And this one is. I found a neat book called The Machine That Changed the World. I'll mention it again at the end, and the type of person that might like to read it. But a lot of the ideas in Agile, some of them have become kind of memes of themselves. A lot of the ideas in the whole Agile philosophy and in DevOps itself come from the idea of lean manufacturing, which is something that came out of the automotive industry. And this book, The Machine That Changed the World, mentions the Andon board, which is one of the tools that Toyota used. Now other places use it as well. But it's a set of displays that were visible to every single worker in the manufacturing plant. And if there was ever any problem anywhere in the plant, it would show up on the display for everyone to see. And anyone in the plant could pull a cord by their workstation and say, I have a problem, and it would pop up on that board. Everybody would swarm the problem and fix it as soon as possible because they realized if you let a problem that's in one part of the production line fester and rot, then other parts of the production line will start to get backed up, and eventually it will lead to less things being made. In Toyota's case, cars, but in our case, new features. So if there's ever a problem, you have a policy of we all swarm in together, we all fix this thing until it's fixed, especially if it's something that's affecting production or end users or things like orders on a commerce site or a form that needs to be filled out. Everybody gets together and fixes that problem. And that helps a lot with making people happier and especially making your apps better. Another thing that I have as a tool, and I talked a little bit about this earlier with the idea of timing your developer or timing a new Jira admin to see how long it takes them to get started. I actually did a blog post after DrupalCon last year because at DrupalCon, my goal at DrupalCon was to find some way to make the beginner's experience with Drupal better. I think we did a little bit of that by making it easier to install Drupal without having to download anything extra whatsoever. And so I did a blog post talking about different local development environments, including the new one that's built into Drupal core. It's not the best one by far, but it's super quick and easy, and if you have PHP running, you can install Drupal now with no other tools. And so in that blog post, I mentioned one of the things that I did was I took all these different tools and I measured time to Drupal. Basically, from the time you click the download link for whatever it is, Drupal core, Orlando, or Drupal VM, or whatever it is, how long does it take from the time you click that button to the time that you have Drupal running on your computer that you can click around on it? And if it takes you more than 10 minutes, so that applies to Drupal core, but this is for our projects too. If it takes you more than 10 minutes for an existing developer to go from nothing at all to having the project up and running on their computer, you should probably start thinking about ways to make it faster. And if it takes, a new developer might have a couple more things to do. Oh, they realize they also have to install PHP, so they have to install Homebrew, so they have to do this, and they have to make sure whatever's running on their computer. It can take a little bit longer for a new person. But if you completely destroyed your computer and got a new one, would it take you more than 10 minutes to get started? If it does, then that could be a sign that it's not. You're going to have more friction in your local development process. And also, sometimes people are like, well, but I need that database from production, and it's like 12 gigabytes. That should be an unbelievably rare problem to have. Most development work doesn't require all the data that's direct from production, even if it's sanitized. There's security concerns there too, but it shouldn't take you that long to get a local development environment. Another one is dev to prod. I mentioned this earlier. One of the metrics that we track is how long does it take from the time that you have code running in a development environment that's approved and good to the time that it's on production running, helping your customers see valuable new features for them. And if this process takes more than a day from the time that you approve it to the time it's running in production, that's also not a great thing. And you start to wonder, like, why? Why does it take more than a day for something new to get to production? Is it because we don't have a good deployment workflow? Is it because we have a process that requires 12 approvals through change management and change review boards and things? You need to find ways to cut that down to make it so that you can get all the value that you've just worked on out to your customers and to the users of your sites. And another thing that's important to keep in mind with this is the DevOps handbook, again, has a good quote on this. One of the best predictors of short lead times in these high-performing organizations was having small batches of work. So a lot of people say, well, we have change windows on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m., and so we can't deploy changes outside the change windows. That would just be ludicrous. So modern Drupal can be deployed without having major outages and things like that. It is possible to do during a workday. And every hour that's spent where there's code that's working that is not out on production is a wasted hour, and also leads to potential issues when you integrate all that code together for that big batch of changes. You will likely have more problems, and it will be harder to figure out what caused the problem because you have 10 things that changed instead of one thing that changed. So short lead times, meaning as work gets done, it's deployed to production. And again, I was hesitant to use this word because it's a loaded word sometimes for people who have been burned by Agile that didn't work very well. There's an idea of takt time, T-A-K-T time. And that's the average amount of time it takes between delivering units of work. And this is a measurable way that you can see a metric of how good you're doing at deploying new things. You can say, we have 7 tickets in our current sprint or our current period of time that we're tracking, and measure the time it takes from the time the first ticket gets out to production to the second to the third. If you're doing batch changes, then try to figure out a way to not do that. But how long does it take between new features and bug fixes that you're deploying? Does it take you an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year? I've seen places that take a year between the time that they deliver new features. It's not very fun to work in those environments. So if you batch things together, you're going to have a very long takt time, and you're not delivering valuable stuff. There was a presentation last call. I totally am blanking on your name. Kelly? Yeah. And who were you with? Rob. Kelly and Rob had another good presentation that was in here earlier. I'm sorry, there were some other presentations I really wanted to see, but the track that was in this room was of interest to me. So there was like the Composer one, there was one on Lando, lots of great presentations, but they had a really good little demonstration that they do in their workshops, this penny flipping thing. Go watch the video for it. I'm not going to describe it in detail, but it quickly illustrates how horrible, how way slower it is to do work in batches. And that's completely discounting the fact that you'll have less defects. You also have slower work getting delivered. So go and check that presentation out as well. So, these tools, the tools that I mentioned in this presentation, they might not be the tools that you might have been thinking about when you think, oh, DevOps tools. You might be thinking Lando and DevShop and Tugboat and Docker, Composer, Kubernetes, Amazon, all these different things. But in my mind, if you want to start implementing DevOps in the real world, those tools might be helpful as an implementation detail. It might be faster for you to use one of these tools than another to build your local development environment more quickly, but the tool is not the most important thing here. The thing that you need in real-world DevOps is better process, better communication, and better relationships. And if you do that, you'll truly end up making people happier while making apps better. Thank you. So I did mention I was going to talk about a few of the resources. So the DevOps Handbook, if you're interested in becoming a person who is, basically if you're an architecture nut, but you want to do it the right way, where you know all the right things, but you do all the right things too, the DevOps Handbook is really good at kind of taking a lot of the real-world situations and turning them into what the best solution is and how to get there as well. The Phoenix project is, I would call it in some ways a companion book, but I would say I loved this book not because it had great advice. It does have some good advice, but it was a book that I totally related to 100% because I was on a team at a company that was like exactly the bureaucratic hell that book mentions. So the Phoenix Project is another interesting book along the same theme, but I think some people might not benefit as much from that book. It's more like if you've experienced bureaucracy hell at a company, it's a great book for you to read. Another book that a lot of these terms are discussed more in depth is Refactoring. And that book talks a little bit more about software development process and code changes and things, but it has a lot of good mentions of things like Yagni. Another book that gets to the people side of things, this has nothing to do with DevOps. It was written way before DevOps was even a buzzword, before I could start using it to profit with my books. But this book is The Mythical Man Month, and it talks about basically the way that we manage relationships and people on teams and how we can make teams that make Drupal better and make software better. And finally, a book that's very esoteric, if I'm saying that correctly. It's a little bit more specialist. Most people here probably would get super bored of it, but if you love the learning the principles behind things and you are doing Agile right or you want to do Agile right, it's good to know the principles behind it and where that research came from. So The Machine That Changed the World is another good book for that. And I do have, I don't know, is there time for questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come find you with a microphone.
That sounds a little ominous.
Yeah, there's a big guy coming to find you.
I don't actually have a question, I just want to make you walk all the way up here. Cool. First of all, what a wonderful talk. Thank you. My question has to do with something I'm afraid may date you, or maybe not. Any thoughts on DevOps and the structured Agile framework? Safe, and is there a role for that in what you've done with your work, or is that just, sort of 2016?
So you said structured Agile framework?
Framework, safe.
So I'm not too familiar with that, and so it doesn't date you. It's just I do not have the knowledge, unfortunately, to answer that.
I just wanted to, again, thank you for your talk, and I loved the way you made everything very simple. But at the end, you said 3 things, and I was writing, and you said better process, better communication, and I can't remember what the 3rd thing was.
Better relationships.
Better
I
relationships.
probably should have put that first because, again, it's about people first. Also, my this whole talk will be on my blog, and the slides and video will be up, but I'm also... I like watching some of the videos, but usually I like to read through it more. No offense to you, Kevin. I do watch some videos, but because of that, I try to also put all my thoughts in Word, and so on my blog it'll be up soon.
I'm sorry, I can't resist myself. Scalable Agile Framework 4.6 officially intends and adds DevOps to it, so it's in there.
Yeah.
There you go. Somebody who's...
I was just looking for your thoughts on it. I know it's in there.
Talk to him after the presentation. I'm sure he has an opinion on it.
Just a little cautionary tale. The book you talk about, Mission That Changed the World, was written in the 90s?
80s, late 80s, I think.
Late 80s, early 90s, after a huge thing. I read it in grad school right when the brakes issue came up with Toyota,
Yeah.
where they took the same study and realized that they were doing a lot of groupthink. So I highly recommend the read. It was very good.
Yes.
But also keep that in mind. If you do that,
Yeah.
don't fall into groupthink.
No, it's a very good. I mean, I use the term cargo cult. Groupthink is another good term to apply to this. You always have to step back and think: are the processes? Are we using them because they are highlighted as Gartner says that it's the best way to do it, or my developer says that this is really cool, or have you actually explored it and found this is helping us? The amount of times that we have to wake up in the middle of the night has gone down this year because we did these things. The proof is in the pudding. You start implementing some of these changes, and it might be like, let's say you switch to start using Drupal VM and you find out that it's actually harder for developers to have a consistent local environment. That's, Drupal VM might work well for some people, but it doesn't for other people, and that's why other tools exist. And that's, the framework. So the framework that I present is a little bit, I try to think more about the people and the app aspect of it and less about the actual implementation. So that's why I really hesitate to use words like tact and on and other kind of agile terms, because they're loaded terms. And you bring up a really good point that it's good to know the history behind them. It's good to know what it is and how to practice it. But it's also good to know that it's not going to necessarily be the right thing for your team, especially if your team is doing something a little different.
All right, does anybody else have any other questions? That's all right. I'll walk for Reggie.
You're going to work out today.
It's good. I got to work off the house and 25 people.
A purely hypothetical question. You come up with an idea to improve your process, and you go through with it, and the team tries it out, and after a month, it turns out everybody thinks the new process is great, but you find that it's slowing things down a little bit. Or maybe it's the other way around. Everyone hates it, but you see that everyone's being more efficient. Which do you pay attention to more? The team's feelings about the new process, or the measurements you get for the new process?
That's tough, because that goes back to why I sometimes enjoy my projects where I'm the only person on it, because I don't have to worry about it. If I don't like it, I'm not going to do it, But there are some times when a process. So, for instance, if you have certain security requirements that are mandated because of some law, usually you're not going to like those requirements, but you're going to have to do them. Sometimes with processes, it can be similar. Especially, if a developer team is used to doing something for years, and you find out that thing actually caused the software to be more flaky or something, and you start doing something new that's a little bit more involved, so some of the developers are kind of gripey, or QAs are annoyed that they don't have as many tickets flowing through per day, something like that. There's always going to be that friction, and I think that goes back to you have to have managers who can have strong opinions and help guide people. And it's kind of like, I'm a parent now, and I have 3 kids, and they're all very young. And getting them to understand that brushing their teeth is good for them is sometimes difficult, but I know it's good for them. They know it, they sometimes know that it's good for them. And even though it's painful, we still do it, because in the end it's going to be a better result than not brushing their teeth. But that's really something where you have to know your team, and you have to know, you also have to prioritize. Sometimes if it's a marginal improvement, it might be better to do the worst method because people are happier. It's a balance. You have an opinion.
Do you have an opinion on hashtag NoOps?
Yes. I think that's impossible in one sense, but it's entirely possible in another. The idea of NoOps that he's mentioning is the idea that basically you offload the entire responsibility of running your applications to somebody that you pay for service. Whether that's you're using serverless Lambda on Amazon, or you're using some hosted solution, something like that, and you build all of your tools so that everything can be automated to the point where your developers commit code and it goes up and does whatever it needs to do and it's running. And there's no people who are like managing your servers or managing your applications that are running or doing that tooling work that sometimes is essential. And it definitely is a good solution, especially for like a simpler app, I think. Simpler things that don't necessarily need a whole lot of management and a whole lot of power. But I think that if you want, it's kind of like outsourcing. There's upsides and downsides. You do save money on resources, people, human beings, who might be helping your company have better uptime and better statistics and performance and coaching people on how to do things the right way for scalability and things like that. You can save money by not having those people resources, but you might also lose money if you end up in a situation where developers who might not know the right things to do and teams that don't have the right structures in place, they build things that are slower or that don't have the same feature set as other people's applications who do have ops personnel. So it's mixed. I think that any larger organization with more than 10 or 20 people should have some sort of operations people. They might not be sitting there managing servers and looking at dashboards and stuff all the time, but they should be doing things, focusing less on the development work and more on making things running, making things run better, you know.
Great. All right. Let's give Jeff another round of applause.